Hello, I'm Megan McArdle. I'm a writer and blogger for The Atlantic Monthly.
And I'm Kerry Howley. I'm a senior editor at Reason Magazine.
And we're here today to talk about feminism, libertarianism, and I guess we're the lipstick libertarians.
Oh, are we?
I don't know. I've been called a lipstick libertarian. I'm not quite sure whether that was supposed to be an insult or a compliment.
I take it as a compliment.
So, I guess we should just start off by talking about, you said something in our email that I thought was really wise, which is that in a lot of ways, like, feminism and libertarianism should be a natural fit.
Yeah.
But they often don't seem like they are. So, you want to talk about, like, what caused you to say that? Was there any particular inspiration, or?
Well, I had seen that people had been speaking of you as if you were naturally an anti-feminist as a libertarian. And that's in a way that's understandable, because not because you're anti-feminist in any sense at all, but because I think that there's this tradition that has been labeled individualist feminism or libertarian feminism, which has been cast and is in some aspects possibly more antagonistic to feminism than it really ought to be if it were going to be truly libertarian. And so I think it's actually I think that the tradition has made it quite difficult for people to understand the affinities between libertarianism and feminism, which, when you just think about it in the most basic terms, ought to be quite obvious. I mean, a book like The Second Sex is nothing if not placing itself in opposition to something like a group identity. It's a book about individualism, even though de Beauvoir was, in the end, a Marxist. And I think a lot of that gets obscured in the conversations that we might be having just because of the way that they're framed.
Well, I think a lot of it, too, is that, you talk about de Beauvoir being a Marxist, and historically, right, the women's movement has been associated with the left. It's been associated with, like, radical economic politics in a way that I don't think it has to be.
Right.
But it sort of always has been, and it's often also, like, certainly the feminist movement of the late 19th century became very attached to this idea of moving into the progressives, of sort of providing state support and remaking America in a more sort of communal, family-like environment that would then sort of have the state subsume a lot of the roles that were traditionally performed by women, instead of sort of questioning whether those roles needed to exist or whether they couldn't be more equitably distributed.
I think that's true, but I think from the other side, you've had libertarians who are really, for some strange reason, unable to understand social conditioning as it applies to women, probably because for so long they've defined themselves against feminism. So whereas libertarians seem very capable of understanding, for instance, that I am accepting of this smoking ban because I have been conditioned to into this sort of state of infantilization by the state. When it comes to high school girls who don't want to take science classes, suddenly that awareness that preferences are shaped by the culture in part slips away.
Yeah, it's actually I think it's an interesting conundrum for libertarianism more deeply. Okay, I'm pretty well acquainted with, like, an anarcho-capitalist who actually comes from sort of like a deeply religious ethnic community. And so I would have conversations with him, and ultimately often we would get to a point where he'd say, my biggest worry about anarcho-capitalism is that in some ways social control is more oppressive than state control. Like, state control is a lot easier to work around than having your neighbors spying on you.
Yeah.
And that a lot of the social reinforcement mechanisms that anarcho-capitalism may end up relying on could actually inhibit autonomy about choices much more thoroughly than merely having a law about those things.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I think that's a great point. But I think that some of the natural affinity I was talking about between libertarianism and feminism comes from the fact that if you look at the arguments against patriarchy and start casting them as arguments against the state, they're almost identical. And so you've got these interlocking systems of oppression, and both sides are refusing to acknowledge one side of those systems.
Yeah, I think this is actually, like, I mean, that sort of gets to the heart of it in a way, is, right? Like, you look at you've got two groups of people looking at two separate power structures that they're suspicious of.
Right.
And so, like, for libertarians to say, like, the state is oppressive is easy, but then if you start saying, culture conditions people's preferences, what do you there's, I think, a feeling possibly that, like, what are you left with, right? If we don't, that we need to say that people's choices, when they're not conditioned by the state, are always good, because they're always in some sense admirable, or shouldn't be at all addressed. We shouldn't ever talk about whether those are a good idea or how should we fix them. Because if you do, then you're opening up a role for the state, which is actually, in fact, what feminists do, right? Like, they identify a power structure that they're against, and they say, so what we need to do is build up this new gigantic power structure that's going to smash the old power structure. And for me, and I think for you, I don't like power structures. I don't like them when they're patriarchal, and I also don't like them when they're the state. And I think, like, and one of the reasons I think I get labeled as an anti-feminist is that for me, feminism is one of many priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the ultimate thing is human liberty and autonomy, and giving people sort of, like, the most space to make choices about their lives as possible. And so, for feminists, you look at something like unequal pay, and that's so unjust, and that's supposed to trump everything else, that the natural sort of response is, oh, well, we need to go make a law about this. We need to go, like, get some power on our side so that we can take the power from the other people. And I would just rather say, like, why don't we think about how we can give all of the institutions outside of people less power?
Right.
But that's, like, hard, I guess. It doesn't give you, like, an easy policy sort of. All you can do is just keep saying to people, like, no, this isn't a good idea. Let's rethink this.
But, of course, those aren't the other two options, and I think you actually do have a very sensitive understanding of social conditioning. And the danger of this impulse to say, well, every choice that you make that happens to conform to a gender norm, we won't question and is an authentic expression of you, and let's just ignore any social impulses around you. The danger is that you end up essentializing those differences in a very silly way and then telling some Darwinian just so story about why women like pink because, it has always been thus and we've evolved in such a way.
I'm actually, you can't see, of course, but I'm actually wearing a pink headband, which I see as a basic expression of
That's
who
true,
I am
and
as a
I'm
person.
denying my essential nature with my lime green shirt.
Oh gosh, Kerry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We need to talk.
I'm the
How could
anti-feminist
you? How could you betray womanhood this way?
It's really shameful. But
So
I think what you're talking about is like a certain. I don't see these priorities as necessarily conflicting because I think it should be pretty clear that one prerequisite to like an effective feminist order ought to be a growing and healthy economy in which there is demand for female labor, so that there's an option outside of the home, right?
Well, I think that there's, like, this sense, though, that, for me, like, state-sponsored childcare, that's not something I support. And, that's one of those things. It's like, we need to change the economy, right? Like, we don't just need to identify ways in which women are being shut out of the economy. What we need to do is try to equalize this thing. I actually do think that there's probably where I part ways with feminism most directly is just that I think that reproduction is just inherently unfair. And it's never going to be fair. There's never going to be any point at which you have this thing that's just absolutely like 50-50 split both ways. And so, like, I certainly get impatient when you get like the men's movement guys who come in and say, it's just so unfair that women get to choose and men don't have the choice about whether they're going to have a kid or not once one's been conceived, right? Like, they have to pay or they don't, and it's entirely on the woman. And it's like, well, but are you going to get all upset when your wife gets fat and her face gets changed by the practice of having children and her body swells up and then, she never looks quite as good again and, she has all of these physical problems, etc., and all of these hormones that swamp her and she's breastfeeding? Are you going to be, like, deeply upset about the injustice of that? Are you going to try to go, no, they're not. But on the other side, I think that, a lot of feminist issues end up being about the fact that it's unfair on the other side, right? Like, abortion is sort of fundamentally, I think, for feminists, about the fact that reproduction isn't the same for women as for men. And so what they would like is some way to like biologically walk away in the way that men get to, and that abortion is like a substitute for that.
Yeah.
And I'm pro-choice. I see it as a much more subtle conflict of two really important things and my priority in doing it isn't to say, well, it's not fair that women get pregnant and men don't, so what we have to do is make it possible to surgically rectify that unfairness. For me, it's just about like the fact that you've sort of got two conflicting rights there. You've got the woman's body and you've got the fetus, and they both have value, and you sort of have to decide which one has more value at what time. And I'm, for example, partial birth abortion, unless it's for a health reason, at that point I think the fetus has taken on more value and therefore like probably trumps your interest in not being pregnant for another 2 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can also see it as an issue of your positive right not to have your body invaded. But to get back to what we were saying about sort of the state support of childcare and how that kind of equalizes the situation in which capitalism doesn't seem to be supportive of the sort of women's reproductive capacity, that worries me because the argument always seems to be at some level, well, bearing children isn't a choice like other choices.
Right.
But then what is it, right? And if it's not a choice, what does it say about a woman who chooses not to have children? I mean, is it like part of our essential nature that we must breed, and if we haven't done it, then we haven't fulfilled ourselves in some way? I mean, that's just not a train of thought I want to go down, and that's part of the reason I think the pill and abortion are kind of deeply important to equalizing in very much the way that leftists are talking about. But I wouldn't want to go as far as saying, now we need to redistribute resources because women must have children and we must support them.
Yeah, I also find it maddening. Like, I was listening to, in fact, a Blogging Heads TV on my drive up to New Jersey this weekend. I was listening to this Blogging Heads TV between two feminists, fairly far left, who were talking about that article that we both saw in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was a really fascinating article. Yeah, it was a great article. But they kept saying, like, this just goes to show, because, like, for readers who didn't see it or watch that Blogging Heads TV, the gist of the article is that Southern Europe, where social roles are much more traditional, has a very low birth rate. They're what's responsible for Europe's really like catastrophically low birth rate. You're talking about places where you're getting barely more than one woman per child, and like maybe in a minute we can discuss whether we should care about that or not. But like assuming that we should care about it, which was the thrust of the article. And I certainly think, like, economically and socially, a slow population decline is fine. Very rapid population decline can have a lot of issues. So they've got very rapid population decline. You've got a situation, as in China, where you've got, what they call the 4-2-1 problem of 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 grandchild who's responsible for everyone up the tree. And so the reason that they have this low birth rate, and the reason like Russia has a low birth rate, is that men don't see it. First of all, women are expected still kind of, they work until they have kids, or they work until they get married, but they're expected once they have kids to stay home, which is what my mother did. But that, that puts a lot of burden on families, especially in places where you've already got a really high tax burden to pay for pensions, the pensions you already have, and so forth, and a large welfare state to support. Mm-hmm. So people are having 1 kid because they want to put off childbearing as long as possible, and, the feeling is if you have to stay home with a kid for 10 years, then you don't want to. And in Northern Europe, there's just massively more support for, first of all, like, fathers do more. They just do a lot more in the home. But also, the workforce is set up, you get mandatory maternity leave and so forth. And so these 2 women were discussing it, and they kept saying, well, this just goes to show that what we really need is this massive state apparatus. And, like, inside, I'm sitting there screaming, no, what about the U.S. birth rate?
Yeah.
Right? And then we sort of, like,
think
glossed it.
That the argument that was put forth, I think it was Russell Shorto,
yes.
I think it was a pretty strange extrapolation from the data. I mean, let's look at the 2 places with high birth rates, Northern Europe and the United States. What do they have in common? Well, they have norms. that are really remarkably supportive of working women. We might not think that, knowing all the sort of the social context and the mommy wars and whatever, but really compared to almost every place on earth, this is a country that's very supportive of working women as far as norms, but not as far as state support. That's what we share. And these are the two places with very high birth rates for a developed country. And so I really think it's the norms that are doing most of the work there. I don't think it's state support. I mean, there are plenty of countries with massive welfare systems that are not producing the sort of birth rates that people find most, because of status quo bias. Everyone wants the birth rate to be 2.1. And then, you look at a place like you were saying, like Singapore or like Japan or South Korea has an extremely low birth rate. And I think the reason is it's just the opposite of that. You have to choose between your identity as a mother or your identity as a working woman, and a hell of a lot of women are saying, I prefer to be at work than to be in my, my comfortable concentration camp, as it were. So
right, in Japan, a lot of them are just saying, I don't want to get married, because even getting married, like, all of a sudden you leave work and then you end up, you're like stuck in the house with your mother-in-law, which is not what most people dream of in the 20th century, and they see other opportunities. And I think more generally, like, the men I know from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe, but also they say, like, they won't date American women because American women are way too demanding.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure I'm just, like, feeding into the men's movement, but, like, my interpretation of that is, like, American women demand to be treated like they're people. And there's nothing wrong with asking to be treated like a person. American women expect that men are going to, pull their weight around the house, and they're expecting that, that there will be a lot more negotiation in a marriage or in a relationship than there is in a relationship where it's like, you're going to stay home. And I remember talking to my Russian office mate about this, and he said, my girlfriend would be ashamed to let me cook. And I mean, like, it just goes, like, this is how far, and he may be right? Like, it may be internalized that far that, like, she really wouldn't want him to do anything around the house. But so, yeah, I think American women have a cultural expectation that, like, there's going to be, you're going to work it out. It's not just like, I'm going to do all the housework and you will go out and go to an office, or that you get to sort of make these decisions. We're going to have a partnership here.
Not that everything's so rosy. I mean, because one of the really interesting, I think, findings of recent social science is that norms really do lag within the household, and that women are still doing, like, so much more of the housework and so much more of the childcare and that sort of thing. And I actually don't think that we're going to reach a point where, like, men and women are doing exactly the same amount until we are willing to outsource much more of the work. I don't think it's really about shifting the burden onto men. I don't think they're ever going to take it. I think we're going to have to learn to kind of embrace daycare and embrace ordering out even more than we do, and embrace maid services and things like that before we see women actually lowering much further the amount of work they do within the home. But that is interesting.
You and I both use the same cleaning service, I believe.
That's right. And I love them.
I love them because, and it's funny, like, one of them's a guy.
Yeah.
It's a very gender balanced team, one man, one woman. But it's, and I guess, like, I think part of it is that women have to, like, and like, women have to challenge their own internal norms about being house proud and about feeling like, I love doing many of the sort of traditionally, I needlepoint and I like to cook and so forth, but but you have to stop feeling like this is something that you have to do to be a woman, and something that, like, your house has to look perfect, or else, you've somehow failed as a woman.
Right. Well, we all know couples who the male will say, well, she does more of the cleaning because she just insists that it be cleaner. It's not my fault. I just have lower expectations. But of course, those expectations are not formed in a vacuum. When people come over and see that your house is messy, they look at the woman for an explanation.
Absolutely. And I think, like, I certainly feel like when people walk into my house and it's messy, even though, like, my friends know that I'm messy, I basically, all of my horizontal surfaces, except the floor, have things piled on them most times. But every time they walk in, like, I have this little voice in my head, which I think is my mother, saying, oh my God, how can you let people see this? And it's not like my house is filthy. I'm good about cleaning, because I, grew up in a city and I'm terrified of bugs and so forth. But I really, like, papers everywhere don't bother me. But nonetheless, like, I don't think guys feel that way. Like, I don't think that when someone walks into, like, our male friends' houses, some of which are pretty impressively messy.
Yeah.
I've never had one of them go, like, I'm so sorry for the mess.
That's an excellent point, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's largely because they don't see it as a personal failing, or they don't expect you to look at them and wonder why it's messy.
Or I think they see it as a personal failing, but they see it as a personal failing akin to, like,
drinking too
not
much,
singing well, or having had a few too many last night. They don't see it as, like, I feel it as, like, a deep personal failure that I'm not Martha Stewart.
Right. This is a reflection of the internal workings of my mind, and I'm deeply ashamed.
Exactly. I just don't care enough, which is what it really comes down to. But, like, so I hire Filipinos to do it, and they care. And it's great, right? I get a clean house, they get money. So we both got something we valued out of it more than whatever the alternative use is for. So gains from trade, libertarian. But that's actually a thing. I think maybe this is a good thing to talk about. Is that the left doesn't. In the case of childcare, they do, but in the case of a lot of other things, they're really against that stuff, right? They're really against paying someone to clean your house. What they want is for workplaces to give people more time off so that men are cleaning the house too. Or so that it's easier to keep the house clean, or so that they have more time to do that stuff. But they're uncomfortable with the implications of paying someone to do these kinds of traditional things. And it's weird, right? Because as soon as it moves outside the house, they're perfectly comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. No one thinks, like, God, my dry cleaner, I just feel so bad about using a dry cleaner. I mean, like, maybe some radical environmentalists do. But in general, most people don't feel like using a dry cleaner or buying, buying checks at the store instead of hand brewing your own oatmeal that you've ground yourself are concessions to some sort of capitalist order. But somehow the minute anyone enters your home, there's a feeling that this is exploitative, that it's, that we should all be living in this homespun universe of spending a lot of time at home. And it's like a very European conception, right? Because their tax rates are so high. They do, in fact, do all that stuff. Right. There
isn't this outsourcing of labor, and there aren't the number of guest workers you would see in a place like Singapore. I mean, every family in Singapore over a certain income has a nanny, which is still seen as somewhat of a luxury here. Certainly one I'll probably never be able to afford. But in a country with a relatively open immigration regime, that suddenly becomes affordable. And, from my perspective, I would like a woman who's not in a particularly good position in a developing country to have the option to come here and to work if she would like. But there's a libertarian preference toward expanding options, which the left doesn't always share.
Exactly. So what's in the news this week? What have you been meditating on?
What I've been preparing for a move, so I haven't really been paying attention much to the news.
I was stuck in Atlantic City this weekend without a wireless connection. So, which is like for a blogger or something like being stuck on the beach for 2 days with no food. Luckily, we were well fed, but it was very weird, like to come back and have sort of 9,000 things in my RSS reader, and I eventually just had to clear it out.
Did you say you were in Atlantic City? Is that right?
I wasn't in Atlantic City.
Okay.
I was on Long Beach Island, which is near Atlantic City, with a friend's, staying at a friend's beach house, which is, again, outsourcing my vacations to other people's families. But
my one experience in Atlantic City is I was a child, and I don't know why my family was in Atlantic City, but I was really young, and whatever hotel we were staying in, the Miss America pageant was apparently there as well. And my parents, who are kind of socialist Catholics, were just completely horrified by this rank display of materialism in the lobbies with all these sort of prima donnas sitting around in skimpy clothing.
So you're preparing for this move. You're going to Iowa. How is this going to change? Right? Like, DC is set up for young single people.
Yeah.
Iowa, my impression is that it's still set up for like women doing most of this kind of home labor. Have you looked at any of that, or
what do you mean as far as
just like in terms of like fewer prepared food options, not so many cleaners around?
Well, I happily have a partner who's very excited about cooking, so I'm not so worried about that. But as far as cleaning, we'll clean for ourselves. I mean, I'm going to be a poor graduate student, so I'm completely ready to revert to all of those habits, essentially.
So, like, tell me a little bit more about Singapore, because you did a lot. Right. You've done a lot on guest workers there, and also I think a bit on sort of natalism there.
Yeah.
And like that's sort of intimately tied together, right? Like they don't let guest workers even marry there, even other guest workers, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think Singapore actually is quite important to what we're talking about, and it's really reinforced ideas I have about the importance of capitalism and opportunity to women, because Singapore basically has had a very concerted policy of we need our women to work. We're going to do what we can to give them opportunities outside of the home for the economic benefit of all, which sounds kind of sinister, but has brought women just so much more power within relationships in Singapore in a just really, I think, striking way. That I think it's just radically changed since the early 70s. And so there is still that in the home, this very unfortunate power structure, and yet these women have profound economic power, and there's just no way to ignore the fact that was created by a capitalist economy. And I think one of the problems we see in feminism is something that is shared through nearly every ideology, which is that humans always want to see history through faces. They want to see that through persons who are adopting change and forcing change, instead of these nebulous distributed forces, right? So I have X right and Y right because it was handed to me by this feminist and that feminist, and that's always going to be achieved through politics, right? Not through economic growth or achievement. And that just, I mean, there's a whole other story to tell about how women have been encouraged to leave the home and have really seized on that in Asia and are just in a new place of power.
Yeah, I think it's amazing how little this gets emphasized, at least in my readings, which are certainly not encyclopedic, but but you know, I've taken women's studies classes. I feel like I've read most of the foundational texts of sort of the history of the movement, and the way that the story of the movement gets told, it's about politics.
Right.
It's about like the abolitionist movement, and the women who were connected to that, who then, as part of it, started saying, well, we should be free too. And, you know, Abigail Adams' famous letter to John Adams is always thrown in there. And then, you know, it sort of moves through to the progressives and the left and the suffragettes, and then, you know, the Betty Friedan and into the 60s and 70s and 80s. But to me, the story of women's liberation is really fundamental. I mean, like, the right to vote, I think, is much more of a political story.
Right, yeah, sure.
But
well,
even then,
the right to vote is inherently political. There's no other way to achieve that.
Right. But it's also, but even then, it's a lot about women moving into cities where they can have demonstrations, where they start, where there are wealthier women who have time to not be, you know, beating laundry on the line and feeding their 9 children, and so they have time to go and start agitating for this stuff. But definitely the last wave of feminism, the big wave in the 60s, that's all about economic progress. It is all about labor-saving devices and about the decline of physical strength as an important determinant of work.
Right.
Right? Like, you see, this is all about people left the home because they could. They left the home because they didn't have to, you know, if someone has to take care of a house, which someone really did in the 19th century, it was backbreaking all day. You know, man may labor from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. That describes my great-grandmother's life. She was working on a farm 24/7. You know, there was always food to be prepared. She had hired men to feed, as well as a fairly large family. There were clothes, you know, all the clothes had to be taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. That really was a full-time job, and as long as someone had to be doing that job, it made sense to combine that someone with the child care. And then as
but you see that this isn't specific to feminist history. This is specific to the way we always tell history. How did freedom come about? Well, this president gave us freedom. This is why, you know, every presidential biography, inexplicably, it's a 1,000-page tome, goes to the top of the bestseller list. This is how people want their history fed to them, right?
Yeah. I think that that's true, but I also think it's that people want their history fed to them because it gives them this illusion of control, right? It gives us this illusion that we can go out and make something happen because we want it to happen. And I think that's like the unhappy message that libertarians often have for feminists, is it's sort of, or any sort of political movement, is like, there may not be a solution to what you're looking for. The fact that you want it doesn't mean that you can make it happen. And in fact, there was a lot of economic history going into making third wave feminism possible. There was a lot of history that went into enabling women to leave the home in droves and go to work, and that was all about economic development and labor-saving devices in the home that replaced. Like, if you look at these commercials, it's fascinating to me. If you look at ads from the 30s and the 20s, they talk about, there's a lot of the ads for laundry stuff will talk about that Monday evening feeling, and, you know, you're sitting there kind of wondering what the hell that means, and I finally figured out what it was, which is just the sheer physical exhaustion of having spent all day boiling clothes and then wringing them out by hand. And if you've ever done this, like, if you've ever just accidentally, like, soaked a quilt, it's unbelievably heavy. These women were, like, brawny titans, and in fact, like, the first thing women do in any country is when they get any money, they outsource their laundry. Either they buy a washing machine, or they pay someone even poorer than them to do it. It's like, first that, and the next thing is scrubbing floors. And so all of these things, like, they were conditioned by the fact that we had economic progress. And so one of the things that I think is, like, if you hold back economic progress, you may be holding back women's liberation.
Yeah,
right?
I don't.
It may get way better.
Just obviously true.
And you know, and also that, you know, the fact that if you tell it as, we went out and demanded this and then they gave it to us, because, you know, we got loud enough, you miss that, like, you need to sort of look at what's possible within the current constraints and, like, push forward more strategically than I think often the left does on issues.
I think actually, to the extent that we still have a long way to go, the direction in which we would go, I mean, I'd see as, in libertarian terms as well as in feminism terms. I mean, I'm thinking about this silly conversation that we often have about the fact that women aren't contributing to op-ed pages. And so you get these stats that are like, okay, something horrifying, like 1 out of every 20, I'm just making this up, 20 op-eds on the New York Times op-ed page are written by a woman. And the left's explanation is discrimination. And the right, and someone from the right will say, well, no, they're actually, like, it's because they're not submitting anything, right? And, I mean, the fact is that 1 out of 20 I know from working at various outlets is probably reflective of some amount of affirmative action policy on the part of the editor who's saying, oh, good, here's something from a woman, let's put it on the page. And that's even more scary, because then the question is, where are these preferences being shaped? Why aren't women contributing to op-ed pages? Why are they not willing to contribute their opinions in public fora? And, you know, the conversation doesn't end with either it's discrimination or no, women aren't contributing, right?
Yeah, I think there's a reluctance, and I understand it, right? There's a reluctance to say, well, like, the problem is you. You know, like, you guys need to do X. You know, what we want to say is, like, the problem is some institution that we can just go in and be like, stop being like that.
Yeah.
You know, stop discriminating. And in fact, like, I think often the problem is us, and I think it goes down to...
the problem is us, but I really think women
have...
No, I
mean, the problem is us in the sense that, like... Yeah, no, I think the problem is us in the sense that we've been socialized not to do this.
Yeah, right.
Not that I'm excusing the socialization, but, like, given that the socialization is happening, no man can change things to make you want to write an op-ed. You know, that has to happen inside a woman, and you have to talk to women about doing this. And, like, feminists do this. I don't want to, like, sound like they're not. But I think that stuff is actually way more important than the institutional stuff. The institutional stuff at this point is really thin.
Yeah.
And when you try to fix the institutional stuff, you get stuff like comparable worth, which is just these, like, massive plans to create huge bureaucracies that are going to be incredibly inefficient, probably not work, and also require fairly intrusive infringements of liberty. Because it's so much harder to, like, one by one, or even in groups, go and say, like, you guys, I know that the 14-year-old boys are making fun of you, or you know, have also themselves been conditioned to not want women who are opinionated, and therefore you're reining this in. And, you know, you're a 14-year-old girl, and you need to be brave and overcome that.
Yeah.
And it's okay, you will date again. I think that, like, that may be the main outreach message we need to send, which is, like, it is actually true. Men will still date you even though you have opinions. Like,
Yeah.
and just send women into high schools to like send that message over and over. Like, I have an awesome husband. I also have opinions.
Actually, that brings to mind, you are also a product of all-girls schools, is that right?
No.
Oh,
I went to all-girls camp.
Oh, all-girls camp,
I went
okay,
to
that's
co-ed
different.
schools. Yeah, no, I blogged about this, though, a little bit, because I think that there is this weird phenomenon. I don't know whether it's cultural or genetic, and I don't sort of care.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this weird phenomenon where, like, and all-girls schools, people from all-girls schools just describe the same thing, of, like, girls forming little gangs and then ganging up on other girls. And boys do it, too, but they do it in a different way. Like, for girls, it really is, like, every single cabin I've ever seen at any all-girls camp displays exactly the same pattern of a gang forming of most of the girls, and then one girl being on the outs, and then one girl being sort of, like, the neutral arbiter.
Well, the girls' gangs are meaner, right? Because the girls gangs will give you anorexia, where the boys' gangs will just kind of beat you up, right? Those are the two.
Yeah, I think I would. Well, I think I'd rather be beaten up. Although I've not been beaten up that many times in my life, so maybe my preferences are a little bit.
That's right.
But yeah, it's like and that's the thing that bugs me about the phrase anti-feminist so much. Is it's like, you know, there's us and then there's our enemies. And it's like there can be people who just don't agree with you, and they're not your enemies, and you don't need to like reinforce the group. You don't need to up the group by claiming that everyone who has a different opinion, like some people are anti-feminist. In an actual, like, serious
There are people who have
feminist
nostalgia for a day when women did not leave the home. And that's very different from loving markets. But, you know, I just, again, with the libertarian feminism, everyone should read this wonderful essay by Charles Johnson and Rod Long about the affinities, and it's just impossible not to read Betty Friedan and see that she's talking about crushing conformism. And I'm not a huge Rand fan, but The Fountainhead isn't a book about political inequality. The Fountainhead is a book about conformism.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, I don't know if I think it is the dynamic that has shaped sort of like feminist culture of wanting conformity, of seeking conformity to the group at some level. Like, that's what little girls are taught to do, right? They're taught to go into little groups and be like all the other little girls and not make any of the other little girls dislike them by being too different.
Yeah.
By being too obviously better at anything. And I think that dynamic does get reflected upwards.
Maybe, but you were talking about on your blog, you were talking about this sort of pack mentality and also the use of bad statistics, which I agree is quite embarrassing, but that's not a quality specific to feminists. Again, that's the mentality of activists, right? It's the same mentality that someone who's like committed to showing us that internet predators are the greatest like existential threat to humankind, they're not going to be responsible with statistics either, right? This is just like the motivations behind any sort of activism.
I would say my quarrel is not with the activists per se, but women's studies departments. I've seen some shockingly bad statistics come out of women's studies departments and like in peer-reviewed articles. And like I'm now struggling thinking like, but I have definitely read stuff which I knew, you know, like in peer-reviewed articles that I knew was a fake statistic, and that sort of like a moment's reflection should have, by anyone who's trained in any sort of data method, should have known was a fake statistic. Like that half of all emergency room admissions are for domestic violence, or another favorite, half of all emergency room admissions used to be for botched abortions. And these are terrible statistics, and they're clearly stupid. If that were true, if you walked into the emergency room, right, then a third of the people in that emergency room should be women there being treated for domestic violence. They're clearly not.
Yeah,
so,
and it's interesting how those statistics that are used, you know, in the infantilization of women, for instance, the trafficking statistics that the State Department uses are completely made up, and they've admitted as much to the Government Accountability Office that, you know, there's like...
Well, I mean, how did that happen? Like, do you know the backstory behind that?
This is for the domestic measurement. I believe the account in the Washington Post was that it was one guy who was making estimates based on newspaper clippings. So there was just nothing systematic about it, right? And so you come up with this number 50,000. Well, who's going to question me? Because are you pro-human trafficking? Is that your motivation, right? So this is there's just where there's like a huge motivation, there's huge money behind trying to exaggerate the problem. It's not so much the opposite.
Right. Or you get these, like, statistics, and, like, the statistics seem to show that on some measures kids in daycare do worse. Mm-hmm. But the measures, like, they do worse in a really small way. Like, in a really, barely statistically significant. And so, and this is for me, like, I maybe because I was raised by someone who grew up in farm country, and, like, rural Republicans are really, in the North, are really different from rural Republicans in the South. And so, like, my grandmother gives a ton of money to Planned Parenthood every year. Mm-hmm. Which I don't think you would find a lot of, nice old WASP ladies in Mississippi.
Right.
So I was raised, but, like, they just have, like, a very sort of, like, practical approach to these things. I've now completely lost the train of thought that we're on trafficking.
I had something to respond to earlier, but I've also lost the train of thought, but your grandmother sounds lovely.
It's because we're women.
That's right. There were all these numbers you were talking about, and they were, like, moving shapes, and I just couldn't figure it out.
Right, no, but so my mother never told me that she thought I was supposed to be the most and only thing in her, most important and only thing in her life. Like, she thinks that having children is really important, that you should try really hard to do it well. But she didn't think that anything that was good for me required her to sacrifice anything. And that's, like, a discussion that we're not even having, right? Like, instead we argue about, like, you get women's studies groups trying to tear down the statistic, and it should just be possible to say, like, look, I'm not actually required to, like, eviscerate myself for the good of my children.
This is the exact conversation I was actually having with Ross, about that earlier on Talking Points Memo. We were talking about his book, and there's this ideal of a child-centric culture. But look, that comes with costs, and I'm sure that we could engineer the world in some way in which, we'll say, okay, women have to stay home, and along some dimension of favorable outcomes for children, we might find something positive there, right? Let's say literacy rates went up if we forced all women to stay home. Would that make it worth it? I mean, the girl who learns to read earlier than she might have otherwise still has to grow up to be a woman. And so we have to consider the kind of constrained society we're creating when we try to marshal all these resources into making sure that every child has the best possible outcomes.
Right. I mean, I think, like, there are a lot of children in America who have really appalling outcomes, and we should work a lot harder on that. But that's, like, most middle-class kids are going to do really well. And, my grandmother, like, and I know that some social conservatives watching this are just going to eviscerate me, but in fact, like, my grandmother didn't think that she was supposed to spend all of her time entertaining my mother. My grandmother never worked a day outside the home in her life. But when my mom came home from school, my grandmother gave her a cookie and sent her outside to play. And come back at dinner. Yeah. And if it was winter, she put her in a snowsuit and then sent her outside to play. My grandmother women didn't think that their whole lives were supposed to be about children until the 80s. Like, that was a radical shift, this idea, and I think a lot of it has to do with, like, I look at the women who've chosen to stay home. I know very few women who've chosen to stay home with kids who liked their jobs before they left them. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I know a lot of corporate lawyers who've chosen to stay home with their kids, and they didn't like being corporate lawyers. And so, like, they got to a juncture and they said, okay, well, I can do this and I like this better than being a lawyer, which I think is a perfectly valid choice.
Absolutely.
I'm no Linda Hirschman fan. But that said, right, like, when those women stay home, they feel this need now to have an excuse for it. Mm-hmm. So they funnel all the energy that they put into being a corporate lawyer into trying to build these, like, supermonster children.
Yeah.
Who have IQs of 9,000
right.
and are also professional
motherhood, as with pregnancy, becomes this project, right? This sort of cult around pregnancy, it strikes me as this extremely American thing. It's like, I have to be active in my pregnancy, so let me search out all the foods that could possibly harm my child and banish them from my life, right? It's like this constant vigilance because American women are active and they don't want to be a passive vessel for this thing, right? They want to create a project around it. And I think it's an interesting impulse that essentially creates all the stress because then you have a bunch of, like, status competition around who has the baby who's been most protected from mercury.
Well, I actually think it's the flip side of something good that we were talking about earlier, which is that women, like, American society is supportive of women mm-hmm. choosing to work. The problem, like, I don't know if it's a problem, but at any rate, when we do that, right, we create this group of women who are, incredibly sort of like analytical and project oriented, and so they turn pregnancy and motherhood into a project.
Yeah.
And so they apply to it this sort of insane level, and I think it starts with the upper middle class women, especially, as I say, I do think it starts with the upper middle class women who want to stay home but don't feel like they can just say, like, I didn't like my job, I want to stay home and raise my kids. Because that's not really a valued choice among sort of college graduate school elites. And Linda Hirschman would say it's good that it's not a valid choice. I'm all for expanding choices. If your husband, is happy to have you staying home and, like, making a beautiful home for you and the kids, I think that's perfectly great.
I think whether it's a value choice really depends on your peer group. I mean, I don't think it would be valued in our peer group particularly, but, I know women who are living in Greenwich and have chosen to opt out, as the term goes, and that's pretty much expected, I think, because your children are like these massive investments that you really need to spend all your time making sure that they are the monster children that you were describing if you're going to compete with these other women, right? And so in that peer group, it might be looked down upon if you decide to spend some of your time at work. Well, what do you need to do that for?
Right, but it's not, I guess what I'm saying is it's not a valid choice to say I'm doing this for me. Mm-hmm. It's not a valid social choice to say, like, I want to stay home. I want to do this with my life. What it has to be is, like, I'm doing this for the children. I'm doing this so that I can make super children. And obviously, like, the only way to make super children is to stay home with them, and therefore I'm being forced into this thing. But no one is allowed to say the way they were in the 60s, and the problem in the 60s was, of course, that they weren't allowed to say, like, I want to leave my children home with a nanny and go out. But they're not just allowed to say, like, this is the life I want. And in part, it's like, I can imagine if I were married to someone who said, I want to stay home and take care of the children because I think I would enjoy it more, like, I might find... Although, I mean, women who are home, maybe not in Greenwich so much because they have servants and so forth, but in general, women who are home probably work a lot harder than I do. It's just, like, exhausting, unending labor to take care of kids, small children anyway. But it's because that's not a valued choice, right? They can't just say the way my grandmother did, I am going to the bridge club, you go play. Mm-hmm. I'm here to make sure that you are fed and clothed and, like, go to church and so forth. But I am not here to make every waking hour of your life as enriching as possible. Like, my grandparents pretty much figured that provided that you did sort of the basic things that you have to do for children, like educating them and giving them good values, the rest would take care of itself, and indeed it did. Mm-hmm. And my mother had kind of that attitude. Like, my mother didn't, even when she was home, my mother certainly did not think that she was supposed to spend every moment of her life sort of poking at me to see how I was doing. And I think that that's healthy. Yeah, I think that this obsession with children is bad for both the mothers and the children, because children get the idea that the world is supposed to center around them, and then they get out of college and all of a sudden it doesn't, and they're heartbroken and really quite angry. Like, I see that in younger kids more even than I saw it. It was true in my generation too, a little bit. But it's getting more so. It's like this sense that everything in the entire world is supposed to be set up for their benefit, and if it's not, it's because someone's betrayed. I mean,
isn't that just how children are? I would like to believe that that's true. I wasn't coddled as a kid, and I want to believe that the kids who were coddled I was basically ignored, and I'd like to believe that the kids who were coddled are going to be completely screwed up for life. But, I mean, I think kids are resilient, and they figure it out whether you are hovering over them or whether you're, playing bridge, right?
No, I mean, I don't think it's like, I'm not trying to say that we're producing a generation of people who will throw themselves off bridges at the age of 25. I just think that, like, but, in some ways I actually do think, like, because it's spilled over, right, the child predator stuff is a great example of this obsessive, like, I was talking to some woman in New York City who said that she had to walk her daughters to school, and I asked how old her kids were. She's 13 and 8, and I said, well, at least now the 13-year-old can take the 8-year-old to school. And her daughters went to the lycée, which is the French school in New York. And she said, oh, no, I could never do that. They wouldn't let me. They wouldn't let me. And I thought, like, I walked to school in New York City in a much more dangerous neighborhood than she lives in at the age of 10. My best friend got on a crosstown bus at the age of 7.
And when you were younger, the crime rate, I'm sure, was much higher in New York than
much higher. It was much more dangerous. There were prostitutes and drug dealers, in my neighborhood. I walked through housing. I walked past housing projects to get to school. My mother would have died before she had walked me to school at the age of 13. And if she hadn't, I would have killed her because I couldn't have borne the shame of having my mother walk me to school or take her on the bus to school, which is what she did every day, and pick her up. And it was like, this is totally insane. That's not good for the kids because they're not getting, like, they're now so structured. You know, they all have to be concert violinists and awesome athletes and also brilliant so they go to Harvard. Mm-hmm. But their lives are so structured that they have no downtime. They have no time to just kind of sit around and figure it out for yourself. I spent my young childhood, running around my building with 4 other girls my age, just making stuff up. You know, playing games and, like, inventing things. That's not something you should do with adults.
I see what you're saying, and I find that story really plausible. But I've yet to see any... I wish there were some way to measure this, you know? Yeah. I'm just... Because I can think back to my childhood and say, oh, yeah, I mean, I was spending so much time outside and everything, but I was playing hide-and-go-seek. Was that necessarily more valuable than playing some video game in which I'm acquiring, like, better spatial skills or figuring out or problem-solving, you know? I mean, the truth is I spent, like, a lot of time watching Saved by the Bell, sitting in front of the TV. Like, not being hovered over often meant that I was just, like, doing whatever was easiest, which often meant reading some Babysitter's Club novel or something, you know?
Well, yeah, my parents practiced, when they wanted to curtail my activities, they did it mostly passively, like not having a television that I could watch. But no, I think actually the ability to be self-directed is really important, and I do think that and it's not just the mothers, it's like the whole way society is now set up, where everything is about, it starts at like age 3 now in New York, of getting your kids into progressively better schools and after-school programs so they can get into a college, because if they don't get into Harvard, their lives will be devastated and they will never be valuable human beings. Mm-hmm. That whole thing has, like, taken more and more autonomy away from the kids, and it's making them less self-directed because everything is about sort of, like, achieving these tiny little goals to get onto the, you know, it's like a board game almost, right? You're just walking through the steps. And so they have less space to just create... I'm not saying, like, obviously people do. They still write novels, they still have blogs. But I just feel like we're crushing that space inward. We're making it physically harder for them to move around because we're so worried about these, what is it, like 100 children a year out of a population of 5 million. It's more than that. It's like, out of like something like 20 million children in the United States under the age of 18. 100 a year actually, that's just not right. 20 million children a year under the age of 5. Something like 100 a year get kidnapped by strangers. All the other kidnappings in the FBI database are like child custody disputes, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. 100 a year get, and out of these 4 million children, we are so obsessed with 100 that we're making the 20 million stay inside all day, lest they be kidnapped.
Yeah, but don't you feel like there's just, I mean, there's so much anxiety over, like, the top 1% of American children, the children who are going to be fine no matter what. Like, these are the people we're worried that they're overstructured. We're worried that they're not having enough downtime. I mean, it's just, at some level, it's just not worth the exertion because there are so many kids, the kids you were talking about earlier, who have poor outcomes all around, who are really deserving of our... I
think the physical structuring is happening a lot farther down the line.
Do you?
I think there's just less... Yeah, I don't even see kids... Like, a lot more kids were running around my neighborhood than run around in D.C., and it's not just a difference of... The kids are kept closer to their parents.
Yeah.
Even though D.C. now is less dangerous than the New York I grew up in. I don't think it's happening all the way down the line. Poor kids have a lot more freedom in a lot of ways. They have a lot of other stuff that I agree with you. Society should be focusing on first. But for me, the thing is that, like, the physical stuff is an easy fix. Right? All you have to do is say, guys, stop freaking the hell out. It's okay. Like, if you walk to school, they'll be okay.
If your parents are completely programmed to freak out and to see sex predators everywhere, then, you know.
Right. But you know, like, fixing inner city public schools is a massive task that I think we should have gotten started. We should get started on that yesterday.
Yeah.
But that requires a lot of energy, and I think that at the same time, we have enough energy to tell mothers.
Well, the one war
okay.
we can fight from blogging heads is the war on, like, overactive mothering. So
exactly. So, guys, calm down.
Yeah,
like, all the research says your children are going to turn out pretty much like they're going to, unless you abuse them, they'll turn out pretty much like they're going to turn out. Even if you don't have baby Mozart or whatever, like, they'll be fine.
Well, that's probably...
They will not get adopted by a child predator, and look where Kerry... We were both, like, shamefully neglected by our uncaring mothers. Hi, Mom! And we're both here successfully on blogging heads, ranting at you. So clearly, you know, it'll all be okay.
I think that's a lovely, heartwarming advisory note to end on.
Yes, it was great talking to you,
and
I'm sure I will see you before you leave for Iowa.
Absolutely.
So take care, and goodbye, Internet.
Bye.